Galileo Galilei was born at Pisa on the 15th day of February, 1564, of a noble and ancient Florentine family, which, in the middle of the 14th century, adopted the surname instead of Bonajuti, under which several of their ancestors filled distinguished offices in the Florentine state. Some misapprehension has occasionally existed, in consequence of the identity of his proper name with that of his family. His most correct appellation would perhaps be Galileo di Galilei, but the surname usually occurs as we have written it. He is most commonly spoken of by his Christian name, agreeably to the Italian custom, just as Sanzio, Buonarroti, Sarpi, Reni, Vesely, are universally known by their Christian names of Raphael, Michelangelo, Fra Paolo, Guido, and Titan. Several authors have followed Rossi in styling Galileo illegitimate, but without having any probable grounds even when they wrote, and the assertion has since been completely disproved by an inspection of the registers at Pisa and Florence, in which are preserved the dates of his birth and of his mother's marriage, 18 months previous to it. His father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a man of considerable talent and learning, with a competent knowledge of mathematics, and particularly devoted to the theory and practice of music, on which he published several esteemed treatises. The only one which it is at present easy to procure, his dialogue on ancient and modern music, exhibits proofs, not only of a thorough acquaintance with his subject, but of a sound and vigorous understanding applied to other topics incidentally discussed. There is a passage in the introductory part, which becomes interesting when considered as affording some traces of the precepts by which Galileo was in all probability trained to reach his preeminent station in the intellectual world. It appears to me, says one of the speakers in the dialogue, that they who in proof of any assertion rely simply on the weight of authority, without adducing any argument in support of it, act very absurdly. I, on the contrary, wish to be allowed freely to question and freely to answer you without any sort of adulation, as well becomes those who are truly in search of truth. Sentiments like these were of rare occurrence at the close of the 16th century, and it is to be regretted that Vincenzo hardly lived long enough to witness his idea of a true philosopher splendidly realized in the person of his son. Vincenzo died at an advanced age, in 1591. His family consisted of 3 sons, Galileo, Michelangelo, and Benedetto, and the same number of daughters, Giulia, Virginia, and Livia. After Vincenzo's death, the chief support of the family devolved upon Galileo, who seems to have assisted them to his utmost power. In a letter to his mother, dated 1600, relative to the intended marriage of his sister Livia with a certain Pompeo Baldi, he agrees to the match, but recommends its temporary postponement, as he was at that time exerting himself to furnish money to his brother Michelangelo, who had received the offer of an advantageous settlement in Poland. As the sum advanced to his brother, which prevented him from promoting his sister's marriage, did not exceed 200 crowns, it may be inferred that the family were in a somewhat straitened condition. However, he promises, as soon as his brother should repay him, to take measures for the young lady, since she too is bent upon coming out to prove the miseries of this world. As Livia was at the date of this letter in a convent, the last expression seems to denote that she had been destined to take the veil. This proposed marriage never took place, but Livia was afterwards married to Taddeo Galilei. Her sister Virginia married Benedetto Landacci. Galileo mentions one of his sisters, without naming her, as living with him in 1619 at Bellosguardo. Michelangelo is probably the same brother of Galileo who is mentioned by Liceti as having communicated from Germany some observations on natural history. He finally settled in the service of the Elector of Bavaria. In what situation is not known, but upon his death the Elector granted a pension to his family, who then took up their abode at Munich. On the taking of that city in 1636, in the course of the bloody 30 Years' War, which was then dragging between the Austrians and Swedes, his widow and 4 of his children were killed, and everything which they possessed was either burnt or carried away. Galileo sent for his 2 nephews, Alberto and a younger brother, to Arcetri near Florence, where he was then living. These 2 were then the only survivors of Michelangelo's family, and many of Galileo's letters about that date contain allusions to the assistance he had been affording them. The last trace of Alberto is on his return into Germany to the Elector, in whose service his father had died. These details include almost everything which is known of the rest of Vincenzo's family. Galileo exhibits of an active and intelligent mind, and distinguished himself in his childhood by his skill in the construction of ingenious toys and models of machinery, supplying the deficiencies of his information from the resources of his own invention, and he conciliated the universal goodwill of his companions by the ready good nature with which he employed himself in their service and for their amusement. It is worthy of observation that the boyhood of his great follower Newton, whose genius in many respects so closely resembled his own, was marked by a similar talent. Galileo's father was not opulent, as has been already stated. He was burdened with a large family, and was unable to provide expensive instructors for his son. But Galileo's own energetic industry rapidly supplied the want of better opportunities, and he acquired, under considerable disadvantages, the ordinary rudiments of a classical education, and a competent knowledge of the other branches of literature which were then usually studied. His leisure hours were applied to music and drawing. For the former accomplishment he inherited his father's talent, being an excellent performer on several instruments, especially on the lute. This continued to be a favorite recreation during the whole of his life. He was also passionately fond of painting, and at one time he wished to make it his profession, and his skill and judgment of pictures were highly esteemed by the most eminent contemporary artists, who did not scruple to own publicly their deference to young Galileo's criticism. When he had reached his 19th year, his father, becoming daily more sensible of his superior genius, determined, although at a great personal sacrifice, to give him the advantages of an university education. Accordingly, in 1581, he commenced his academical studies in the university of his native town, Pisa, his father at this time intending that he should adopt the profession of medicine. In the matriculation lists at Pisa, he is styled Galileo, the son of Vincenzo Galilei, a Florentine scholar in arts. His instructor was the celebrated botanist, Andreas Caesalpinus, who was professor of medicine at Pisa from 1567 to 1592. Hist. Acad. Pearson. Pisces, 1791. It is dated 5th November 1581. Viviani, his pupil, friend, and panegyrist, declares that, almost from the first day of his being enrolled on the lists of the Academy, he was noticed for the reluctance with which he listened to the dogmas of the Aristotelian philosophy, then universally taught, and he soon became obnoxious to the professors from the boldness with which he promulgated what they styled his philosophical paradoxes. His early habits of free inquiry were irreconcilable with the mental quietude of his instructors, whose philosophic doubts, when they ventured to entertain any, were speedily lulled by a quotation from Aristotle. Galileo thought himself capable of giving the world an example of a sounder and more original mode of thinking. He felt himself destined to be the founder of a new school of rational and experimental philosophy. Of this we are now securely enjoying the benefits, and it is difficult at this time fully to appreciate the obstacles which then presented themselves to free inquiry. But we shall see, in the course of this narrative, how arduous their struggle was who happily effected this important revolution. The vindictive rancor with which the partisans of the old philosophy never ceased to assail Galileo is of itself a sufficient proof of the prominent station which he occupied in the contest. Galileo's earliest mechanical discovery, to the superficial observer apparently an unimportant one, occurred during the period of his studies at Pisa. His attention was one day arrested by the vibrations of a lamp swinging from the roof of the cathedral, which, whether great or small, seemed to recur at equal intervals. The instruments then employed for measuring time were very imperfect. Galileo attempted to bring his observation to the test before quitting the church, by comparing the vibrations with the beatings of his own pulse, and his mind being then principally employed upon his intended profession, it occurred to him, when he had further satisfied himself of their regularity by repeated and varied experiments, that the process he had first adopted might be reversed, and that an instrument on this principle might be usefully employed in ascertaining the rate of the pulse, and its variation from day to day. He immediately carried the idea into execution, and it was for this sole and limited purpose that the first pendulum was constructed. Viviani tells us that the value of the invention was rapidly appreciated by the physicians of the day, and was in common use in 1654, when he wrote, Santorio, of medicine at Padua, has given representations of 4 different forms of these instruments, which he calls pulsologies and strongly recommends to medical practitioners. 6. These instruments seem to have been used in the following manner. Number 1 consists merely of a weight fastened to a string and a graduated scale. The string being gathered up into the hand till the vibrations of the weight coincided with the beatings of the patient's pulse, the length was ascertained from the scale, which, of course, if great, indicated a languid, if shorter, a more lively action. In number 2 the improvement is introduced by connecting the scale and string. The length of the latter is regulated by the turns of a peg at A, and a bead upon the string at B showed the measure. Number 3 is still more compact, the string being shortened by winding upon an axle at the back of the dial plate. The construction of number 4, which Santorio claims as his own improvement, is not given, but it is probable that the principal index, by its motion, shifted a weight to different distances from the point of suspension, and that the period of vibration was still more accurately adjusted by a smaller weight connected with the second index. Venturi seems to have mistaken the third figure for that of a pendulum clock, as he mentions this as one of the earliest adaptations of Galileo's principle to that purpose 7, but it is obvious, from Santorio's description, that it is nothing more than a circular scale, the index showing, by the figure to which it points, the length of string remaining unwound upon the axis. We shall, for the present, postpone the consideration of the invention of pendulum clocks, and the examination of the different claims to the honor of their first construction. At the time of which we are speaking, Galileo was entirely ignorant of mathematics, the study of which was then at a low ebb, not only in Italy, but in every part of Europe. Commandine had recently revived a taste for the writings of Euclid and Archimedes, and Vieta Tartaglia and others had made considerable progress in algebra. Guido Obledi and Benedetti had done something towards establishing the principles of statics, which was the only part of mechanics as yet cultivated. But with these inconsiderable exceptions, the application of mathematics to the phenomena of nature was scarcely thought of. Galileo's first inducement to acquire a knowledge of geometry arose from his partiality for drawing and music, and from the wish to understand their principles and theory. His father, fearful lest he should relax his medical studies, refused openly to encourage him in this new pursuit, but he connived at the instruction which his son now began to receive in the writings of Euclid, from the tuition of an intimate friend, named Ostilio Ricci, who was one of the professors in the university. Galileo's whole attention was soon directed to the enjoyment of the new sensations thus communicated to him, insomuch that Vincenzo, finding his prognostics verified, began to repent his indirect sanction, and privately requested Ricci to invent some excuse for discontinuing his lessons. But it was fortunately too late. The impression was made and could not be effaced. From that time Hippocrates and Galen lay unheeded before the young physician, and served only to conceal from his father's sight the mathematical volumes on which the whole of his time was really employed. His progress soon revealed the true nature of his pursuits. Vincenzo yielded to the irresistible predilection of his son's mind, and no longer attempted to turn him from the speculations to which his whole existence was thenceforward abandoned. After mastering the elementary writers, Galileo proceeded to the study of Archimedes, and, whilst perusing the hydrostatics of that author, composed his earliest work, an essay on the hydrostatical balance. In this he explains the method probably adopted by Archimedes for the solution of Hiro's celebrated question 8, and shows himself already well acquainted with the true principles of specific gravities. This essay had an immediate and important influence on young Galileo's fortunes, for it introduced him to the approving notice of Guido Obledi, then one of the most distinguished mathematicians of Italy. At his suggestion Galileo applied himself to consider the position of the center of gravity in solid bodies, a choice of subject that sufficiently showed the estimate Obledi had formed of his talents, for it was a question on which Commandine had recently written, and which engaged at that time the attention of geometricians of the highest order. Galileo tells us himself that he discontinued these researches on meeting with Lucas Valerio's treatise on the same subject. Obledi was so genius displayed in the essay with which Galileo furnished him, that he introduced him to his brother, the Cardinal del Monte. By this latter he was mentioned to Ferdinand de' Medici, the reigning Duke of Tuscany, as a young man of whom the highest expectations might be entertained. By the Duke's patronage he was nominated, in 1589, to the lectureship of mathematics at Pisa, being then in his 26th year. His public salary was fixed at the insignificant sum of 60 crowns annually, but he had an opportunity of greatly adding to his income by private tuition. No sooner was Galileo settled in his new office than he renewed his inquiries into the phenomena of nature with increased diligence. He instituted a course of experiments for the purpose of putting to the test the mechanical doctrines of Aristotle, most of which he found unsupported even by the pretense of experience. It is to be regretted that we do not more frequently find detail his method of experimenting than occasionally in the course of his dialogues, and it is chiefly upon the references which he makes to the results with which the experiments furnished him, and upon the award and notorious character of his philosophy, that the truth of these accounts must be made to depend. Venturi has found several unpublished papers by Galileo on the subject of motion, in the Grand Duke's private library at Florence, bearing the date of 1590, in which are many of the theorems which he afterwards developed in his dialogues on motion. These were not published till 50 years afterwards, and we shall reserve an account of their contents till we reach that period of his life. Galileo was by no means the first who had ventured to call in question the authority of Aristotle in matters of science, although he was undoubtedly the first whose opinions and writings produced a very marked and general effect. Nisjoli, a celebrated scholar who lived in the early part of the 16th century, had condemned Aristotle's philosophy, especially his physics, in very unequivocal and forcible terms, declaring that, although there were many excellent truths in his writings, the number was scarcely less of false, useless, and ridiculous propositions. About the time of Galileo's birth, Benedetti had written expressly in confutation of several propositions contained in Aristotle's Mechanics, and had expounded in a clear manner some of the doctrines of statical equilibrium. Within the last 40 years it has been established that the celebrated painter Leonardo da Vinci, who died in 1519, amused his leisure hours in scientific pursuits, and many ideas appear to have occurred to him which are to be found in the writings of Galileo at a later date. It is not impossible, though there are probably no means of directly ascertaining the fact, that Galileo may have been acquainted with Leonardo's investigations, although they remained, till very lately, almost unknown to the mathematical world. This supposition is rendered more probable from the fact that Magenta, the preserver of Leonardo's manuscripts, was, at the very time of their discovery, a contemporary student with Galileo at Pisa. Copernic, or, as he is usually called, Copernicus, a native of Thorn in Prussia, had published his great work, De Revolutionibus, in 1543, restoring the knowledge of the true theory of the solar system, and his opinions were gradually and silently gaining ground. It is not satisfactorily ascertained at what period Galileo embraced the new astronomical theory. Gerard Voss attributes his conversion to a public lecture of Maestlin, the instructor of Kepler, and later writers, among whom is Laplace, repeat the same story, but without referring to any additional sources of information, and in most instances merely transcribing Voss's words, so as to show indisputably whence they derived their account. Voss himself gives no authority, and his general inaccuracy makes his mere word not of much weight. The assertion appears, on many accounts, destitute of much probability. If the story were correct, it seems likely that some degree of acquaintance, if not of friendly intercourse, would have subsisted between Maestlin and his supposed pupil, such as in fact we find subsisting between Maestlin and his acknowledged pupil Kepler, the devoted friend of Galileo, but, on the contrary, we find Maestlin writing to Kepler himself of Galileo as an entire stranger, and in the most disparaging terms. If Maestlin could lay claim to the honor of so celebrated a disciple, it is not likely that he could fail so entirely to comprehend the distinction it must confer upon himself as to attempt diminishing it by underrating his pupil's reputation. There is a passage which more directly controverts the claim advanced for Maestlin, although Salisbury, in his Life of Galileo, having apparently an imperfect recollection of its tenor, refers to this very passage in confirmation of Voss's statement. In the second part of the dialogue on the Copernican system, Galileo makes Sagredo, one of the speakers in it, give the following account: being very young, and having scarcely finished my course of philosophy, which I left off as being set upon other employments, there chanced to come into these parts a certain foreigner of Rostoch, whose name, as I remember, was Christianus Cestesius, a follower of Copernicus, who, in an academy, gave 2 or 3 lectures upon this point, to whom many flocked as auditors, but I, thinking they went more for the novelty of the subject than otherwise, did not go to hear him, for I had concluded with myself that that opinion could be no other than a solemn madness, and questioning some of those who had been there, I perceived they all made a jest thereof, except one, who told me that the business was not altogether to be laughed at, and because the man was reputed by me to be very intelligent and wary, I repented that I was not there, and began from that time forward, as oft as I met with any one of the Copernican persuasion, to demand of them if they had been always of the same judgment. Of as many as I examined I found not so much as one who told me not that he had been a long time of the contrary opinion, but to have changed it for this, as convinced by the strength of the reasons proving the same, and afterwards questioning them one by one, to see whether they were well possessed of the reasons of the other side, I found them all to be very ready and perfect in them, so that I could not truly say that they took this opinion out of ignorance, vanity, or to show the acuteness of their wits. On the contrary, of as many of the peripatetics and Ptolemies as I have asked, and out of curiosity I have talked with many, what pains they had taken in the book of Copernicus, I found very few that had so much as superficially perused it, but of those who I thought had understood the same, not one, and, moreover, I have inquired amongst the followers of the peripatetic doctrine, if ever any of them had held the contrary opinion, and likewise found none that had. Whereupon, considering that there was no man who followed the opinion of Copernicus that had not been first on the contrary side, and that was not very well acquainted with the reasons of Aristotle and Ptolemy, and, on the contrary, that there was not one of the followers of Ptolemy that had ever been of the judgment of Copernicus, and had left that to embrace this of Aristotle. Considering, I say, these things, I began to think that one who leaveth an opinion imbued with his milk and followed by very many, to take up another, on by very few, and denied by all the schools, and that really seems a great paradox, must needs have been moved, not to say forced, by more powerful reasons. For this cause I am become very curious to dive, as they say, into the bottom of this business. It seems improbable that Galileo should think it worthwhile to give so detailed an account of the birth and growth of opinion in anyone besides himself. And although Sagredo is not the personage who generally in the dialogue represents Galileo, yet as the real Sagredo was a young nobleman, a pupil of Galileo himself, the account cannot refer to him. The circumstance mentioned of the intermission of his philosophical studies, though in itself trivial, agrees very well with Galileo's original medical destination. Astisius is not a fictitious name, as possibly Salisbury may have thought, when alluding to this passage. He was mathematical professor at Bale, about 1567, and several treatises by him are still extant. According to Kastner, his German name was Verstesen. In 1568 was informs us that he published some new questions on Purbacher's theory of the planets. He died at Bale in 1586, when Galileo was about 22 years old. It is not unlikely that Galileo also, in part, owed his emancipation from popular prejudices to the writings of Giordano Bruno, an unfortunate man, whose unsparing boldness in exposing fallacies and absurdities was rewarded by a judicial murder, and by the character of heretic and infidel, with which his executioners endeavored to stigmatize him for the purpose of covering over their own atrocious crime. Bruno was burnt at Rome in 1600, but not, as Montecla supposes, on account of his Spaccio della Bestia Triumphant. The title of this supposed that it was directed against the Church of Rome, to which it does not in the slightest degree relate. Bruno attacked the fashionable philosophy alternately with reason and ridicule, and numerous passages in his writings, tedious and obscure as they generally are, show that he had completely outstripped the age in which he lived. Among his astronomical opinions, he believed that the universe consisted of innumerable systems of suns with assemblages of planets revolving round each of them, like our own Earth, the smallness of which, alone, prevented their being observed by us. He remarked further, that it is by no means improbable that there are yet other planets revolving round our own sun, which we have not yet noticed, either on account of their minute size or too remote distance from us. He declined asserting that all the apparently fixed stars are really so, considering this as not sufficiently proved, because at such enormous distances the motions become difficult to estimate, and it is only by long observation that we can determine if any of these move round each other, or what other motions they may have. He ridiculed the Aristotelians in no very measured terms. They hardened themselves, and hid themselves, and embroiled themselves for Aristotle. They call themselves his champions. They hate all but Aristotle's friends. They are ready to live and die for Aristotle, and yet they do not understand so much as the titles of Aristotle's chapters. And in another place he introduces an Aristotelian inquiring, "Do you take Plato for an ignoramus, Aristotle for an ass?" To whom he answers, "My son, I neither call them asses, nor you mules, them baboons, nor you apes, as you would have me. I told you that I esteemed them the heroes of the world, but I will not credit them without sufficient reason. And if you were not both blind and deaf, you would understand that I must disbelieve their absurd and contradictory assertions." Bruno's works, though in general considered those of a visionary and madman, were in very extensive circulation, probably not the less eagerly sought after from being included among the books prohibited by the Romish Church. And although it has been reserved for later observations to furnish complete verification of his most daring speculations, yet there was enough, abstractedly taken, in the wild freedom of his remarks, to attract a mind like Galileo's, and it is with more satisfaction that we refer the formation of his opinions to a man of undoubted though eccentric genius, like Bruno, than to such as Maestlin, who, though a diligent and careful observer, seems seldom to have taken any very enlarged views of the science on which he was engaged. With a few exceptions similar to those above mentioned, the rest of Galileo's contemporaries well deserved the contemptuous epithet which he fixed on them of paper philosophers, for, to use his own words, in a letter to Kepler on this subject, this sort of men fancied philosophy was to be studied like the Aeneid or Odyssey, and that the true reading of nature was to be detected by the collation of texts. Galileo's own method of philosophizing was widely different, seldom omitting to bring with every new assertion the test of experiment, either directly in confirmation of it, or tending to show its probability and consistency. We have already seen that he engaged in a series of experiments to investigate the truth of some of Aristotle's positions. As fast as he succeeded in demonstrating the falsehood of any of them, he denounced them from his professorial chair with an energy and success which irritated more and more against him the other members of the academic body. There seems something in the stubborn opposition which he encountered in establishing the truth of his mechanical theorems, still more stupidly absurd than in the ill will to which, at a later period of his life, his astronomical opinions exposed him. It is intelligible that the vulgar should withhold their assent from one who pretended to discoveries in the remote heavens, which few possessed instruments to verify, or talents to appreciate, but it is difficult to find terms for stigmatizing the obdurate folly of those who preferred the evidence of their books to that of their senses, in judging of phenomena so obvious as those, for instance, presented by the fall of bodies to the ground.